Greetings, comrades! If you're starting your journey into Russian, one of the first things you'll notice, right after the alphabet tries to intimidate you, is that Russian is a gendered language, where gender plays a key role in shaping its structure and usage. From nouns to adjectives, pronouns to verbs, numerals to participles, grammatical gender shapes how Russian is spoken and understood. And if you're serious about learning Russian, mastering gender isn't a suggestion, it's a requirement. In this video, I'll guide you through a thorough yet beginner-friendly breakdown of grammatical gender in Russian, complete with practical training to ensure it actually sticks. By the end, you won't just understand gender in theory, you'll have the skills to confidently determine the gender of Russian nouns, paving the way for smoother progress in learning the language. So let's step into the warm embrace of Russian grammar, starting with the basics, what grammatical gender is and why it matters. In essence, grammatical gender is simply a system of categorizing nouns in a way that all nouns, without exception, are put into groups called genders, often without any connection to their real-world qualities. As a result, in Russian, a house, for example, is referred to as he, and water gets the honor of being a she, not because of their biological gender. Obviously, they don't have one, but simply because they belong to different classes of nouns that happen to be associated with gender. Although the division of nouns into gender classes may not seem logical, we should not seek any logic in the gendered way of grouping nouns, as this grouping method derives from ancient and even prehistoric linguistic processes, the details of which have been lost in the mists of time. Speaking from the perspective of numerous cultures inhabiting the light green area shown on the map, we all inherited grammatical gender from our distant ancestors who, in prehistoric times, lived in this dark green Pontic Caspian steppe zone of Eurasia. They spoke our common ancestral tongue, now referred to as the Proto-Indo-European language. In the early days of the Proto-Indo-European language, dating back to about 4500 BC, it seems that nouns were split into two broad classes based on what people of that time understood about the world. The first class, known as the common class, included animate or active nouns, while the second class, known as the neuter class, included inanimate or inactive nouns. Think of it as an early attempt to sort the world into here is life in action versus that's just stuff. As always, it all began innocently enough. Nothing seemed to foreshadow trouble. But then a feminine suffix started to emerge, spreading like wildfire, within just a few centuries becoming deeply embedded. The details and reasons for this process are still hotly debated, but one thing's for sure. An increasing number of nouns from the animate common class were progressively incorporating this new suffix, essentially signaling woman, and thus acquiring a feminine implication. This gave rise to the feminine grammatical gender. In response to the rise of the feminine gender, the masculine gender stepped up to the plate, primarily based on active nouns that didn't receive the feminine suffix. This helped to level the playing field and gradually balance out the presence of the feminine gender. As a result, the common class of active/animate nouns began to split into masculine and feminine genders. Meanwhile, the neuter gender continued to live its own quiet life, reserved for things that didn't quite fit the realm of animation and activity. Fast forwarding to the present day, most European languages, including Russian, as descendants of the Proto-Indo-European language, still belong to the category of gendered languages and comprise at least two genders. For example, Spanish, French, and Italian have two genders, masculine and feminine, while Russian, Greek, and German have retained all three grammatical genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. Nowadays, gender systems are used in approximately half of the world's languages, but thanks in large part to Chinese comrades who have it easy by speaking a genderless language, only 38% of the world's population speaks gendered languages. One of these gender languages is Russian, which has preserved the three-gender grammatical system. According to statistical data, today about 40.5% of Russian nouns are masculine, 43% are feminine, and 16.5% are neuter. Contrary to other gendered languages, English, during the Middle English period, decided it didn't need all the drama and eventually lost its grammatical gender by the end of the 14th century. Although English has a pronominal gender system where gender is marked on personal pronouns, this is not enough to consider it a gendered language. This is because the main criterion for determining whether a language has grammatical gender is the presence of gendered inflections or identifiers that assign nouns to specific grammatical genders. In Russian, those identifiers are grammatical endings that reflect the gender of a noun. So, to learn how to determine the grammatical gender of Russian nouns, we are going to examine their endings. As the name suggests, a grammatical ending is located at the end of a Russian word and indicates whether a noun is masculine, feminine, or neuter. Here is the basic rules for how Russian genders work. If this rule seems a bit confusing, don't worry. After carefully reviewing it and completing just one exercise, you'll immediately become quite proficient in determining the gender of Russian nouns with a high degree of accuracy. Let's examine this rule closely. In Russian, there are three grammatical genders: masculine, feminine, and neuter. Additionally, there is a plural grammatical number that does not have a gender. To determine whether a noun belongs to a specific grammatical gender, we simply look at its final letter. If a noun ends in a consonant, this null sign refers to a consonant, и краткая, or the soft sign, it is masculine. For example, фрукт, музей, январь are masculine nouns. If a noun ends in one of these letters, a, ya, or the soft sign, it is feminine. For example, проблема, семья, жизнь. If a noun ends in o or ye, it is neuter. Examples: вино, море. If a noun ends in ы or и, it is plural, such as актеры, семьи. As you can see within the basic rule, the three genders and the plural number predominantly have unique final letters that cannot be confused. So by simply looking at the last letter of a noun, you can determine its gender. The main fly in the ointment is the soft sign at word final positions, which applies to both feminine and masculine genders. While generally Russian nouns ending in a soft sign statistically lean towards the feminine gender, with 3/4 of such nouns being feminine and 1/4 being masculine, this distribution is largely due to a single suffix, ost, which is present in at least half of all nouns ending in a soft sign. However, if this suffix is excluded, the distribution of genders becomes balanced. As a result, applying a statistical rule of 3/4 to 1/4 for determining gender in nouns with a soft sign wouldn't be appropriate, as this distribution is based solely on one suffix that is mainly found in advanced vocabulary, B2 level and beyond. Therefore, it is important to treat both genders equally when first learning the language. To effectively handle nouns ending in a soft sign, it's essential to go beyond the basic rule and practice a specialized approach. This supplementary rule will guide you in determining the gender of such nouns. A task will tackle once the foundational rule is sufficiently ingrained. Additionally, the basic rule has exceptions. Those are nouns whose final letters, which are used to determine their gender, do not correspond to their actual gender. This usually occurs when biological sex contradicts the grammatical ending. For example, the words мужчина, папа, дедушка, дядя denote men but have feminine endings. In such contradictory situations, natural gender always take precedence over the grammatical ending, so these words are considered masculine. The same logic applies to names. We will explore exceptions in more detail after we have covered the basic rule and the soft sign situation. Additionally, the basic rule for plural nouns is relevant only to the masculine and feminine genders. This is because neuter nouns in the plural have the same grammatical endings as singular feminine nouns. To avoid confusion, it is standard practice to introduce neuter plurals at the middle of the A1 level, along with plural irregulars. That's why this rule focuses only on plurals for masculine and feminine genders. However, let me emphasize that despite its limitations, the basic rule remains highly effective because it applies to the vast majority of nouns. That's why mastering just this one rule will enable you to accurately determine the gender of nouns in, let's say, around 85% of situations. So let's take a closer look at the basic rule to better understand its principles. With the plural form of neuter nouns, the soft sign and exceptions temporarily excluded, you can see the simplicity of this rule. Each gender and even the plural number has its own unique endings that do not overlap. Therefore, if a noun ends in a consonant, including I краткая, it belongs to the masculine gender. For example, Frucht, Muzей are masculine simply because they end in letters that belong to the masculine grammatical gender. If they ended differently, they would belong to a different grammatical gender. As you can see, the pronoun on, like other gendered personal pronouns, follows this rule for nouns as it ends in a consonant. Following the same principle, if a noun ends in a or ya, it belongs to the feminine grammatical gender. For example, проблема, семья are feminine simply because they have feminine endings. If they ended differently, they would belong to a different grammatical gender. As you can see, the pronoun она, like other gendered personal pronouns, follows this rule for nouns as it ends in a. Similarly, if a noun ends in о or е, it belongs to the neuter gender. For example, вино, море are neuter simply because they end in o and ye. If they ended in other letters, they would belong to a different grammatical gender. As you can see, the pronoun оно, which ends in o, like other gendered personal pronouns, follows this rule for nouns. Finally, if a noun ends in y or I, it no longer has a grammatical gender because it takes on the plural form. For example, актеры, семьи are plural forms of the nouns актер, семья. So by looking at the last letter of a noun in its default nominative form, we can determine its grammatical gender or, alternatively, whether it has a plural grammatical number. Now let's examine the contents of this rule more closely. First, let's highlight the null sign. In linguistics, a null sign is used to represent the absence of an expected segment, a segment of a word that is missing but conceptually present. What does this mean? Well, in Russian, this null sign represents a zero grammatical ending, the final part of a word that remains unexpressed or implicit in the default singular nominative form, but can materialize as a real ending in alternative forms. Take the noun проблема. By applying the basic rule, we can see that проблема is a feminine noun because it has the grammatical ending a. To make it plural, we need to replace its grammatical ending. Since a is located before the slash, we need to take its counterpart before the slash as well. Thus, a becomes y, giving us проблемы. So the singular feminine grammatical ending a transforms into the plural y. Similarly, the Russian word неделя changes to недели in the plural, with ya changing to и. So according to the basic rule, to form the plural, we remove a gendered grammatical ending and replace it with a plural one. Gendered endings before a slash belong to the hard type and by default become y, while gendered endings after a slash, as well as the soft sign, belong to the soft type and by default become e. Although this video is not specifically about plural forms, let me point out that when creating the plural, one should always consider 7 special consonants in Russian: g, k, h, ch, zh, sh, sha, after which y is not used. Therefore, kniga, book, in the plural is not knigy, but kniги, with e at the end. However, what if we want to do the same but with a noun that ends in a consonant? Let's consider the noun frukt. To form the plural of a noun that ends in a consonant such as frukt, we need to replace its singular ending with a new plural grammatical ending. However, nominative or default grammatical endings in Russian only appear as vowel letters. Since this noun ends in a consonant and its final letter is part of the root rather than a grammatical ending, there is no grammatical ending to replace. For this reason, we use the term zero ending to refer to nouns that, so to speak, have an imaginary ending that is not represented by a letter. This means that the noun does have a grammatical ending, but it is not directly visible in either spelling or pronunciation. To create the plural form of a noun with a zero ending, such as frukt, we replace the unexpressed or imaginary zero ending with a new plural ending. Since frukt ends neither in и краткое nor with a soft sign, both of which require the plural ending и, we use the first variant y and get the plural form фрукты. That's what a zero ending is, an imaginary yet still legitimate grammatical ending that can become real during transformation. Because of the ability of a zero ending to change freely, it's important not to confuse a zero ending with the absence of an ending. This is because in Russian there are some nouns that do not have a grammatical ending, and these are different from nouns with a zero grammatical ending. We shall address such nouns in the third segment of grammatical gender training after reinforcing the basic rule and addressing the soft sign situation. For now, here is an example. Take the noun kangaroo, which in Russian is kenguru, with the vowel u at the end. Yet you won't find the letter u in our basic rule for the genders of Russian nouns, because this letter is an unnatural ending for a native Russian noun in its default nominative form. Native Russian nouns simply don't end in u. This vowel typically serves as an ending for the dative or accusative grammatical cases, but not the default nominative case. That's why the foreign noun kenguru could not be properly assimilated by the Russian language without changing its final letter, and as a result does not have a grammatical ending at all, not even a zero ending. Since forming the plural requires replacing a grammatical ending, this noun cannot have a distinct plural form. Therefore, if in English you would ask how many kangaroos are in Australia, adding s to form the plural, in Russian we would instead say how many kangaroo are in Australia. Сколько кенгуру в Австралии? So no kangaroos, just many kangaroo. The noun kenguru remains unchanged in both singular and plural, as well as across all grammatical cases because it is indeclinable, meaning it cannot change its form due to the absence of a grammatical ending. The distinction between a zero ending and the absence of an ending is important. A zero ending is a legitimate grammatical ending that, despite not being visible, still performs its function. Conversely, nouns without a grammatical ending remain invariant in all forms. Unless they indicate biological sex, such nouns are considered neuter in gender. When it comes to the zero ending, this concept is approached slightly differently when teaching Russian to foreigners compared to the internal academic perspective. While the Russian internal approach considers a zero ending to follow the letters I краткая and the soft sign, foreign language instruction treats these letters separately and typically omits the idea of zero ending for them. This is because the letters I краткая and the soft sign have unique realizations both in terms of spelling and pronunciation. As a result, these letters are treated semantically as equivalent to grammatical endings. To illustrate this, learning materials for beginners may feature a separator sign to indicate that the segment following the separator is flexible, meaning this part can change based on grammatical case or number when applied to nouns. For example, to make the word музей plural, we equalize I краткая to a grammatical ending. So we remove I краткая and add I to form музеи. The same rule applies to the soft sign. We remove the soft sign from январь to form январи and from жизнь to form жизни. That's it for the theoretical introduction to the genders of Russian nouns. Now we are ready to practice and develop your ability to distinguish between Russian grammatical genders. The good news is that our brain easily absorbs this concept. In fact, completing just this one exercise will enable you to determine the gender of Russian nouns with good accuracy and reasonable speed. And with a bit more practice spaced over time, you will naturally master the skill, effortlessly and instantly identifying the gender of Russian nouns. In this exercise, your task is to identify the gender of the following Russian nouns by looking at their final letters. Then, write the correct personal pronoun next to each noun to show whether it refers to he, он, she, она, it, оно, or alternatively, they, они. For example, in the model, стул ends in a consonant, meaning this noun has a zero ending. That's why it is masculine, as its personal pronoun is он. Машина ends in a, thus it's feminine, and its pronoun is она. Окно ends in о, which is a neutral grammatical ending. Therefore, the noun окно is оно. Чай ends in I краткая, meaning it's masculine, with the personal pronoun он. The noun музеи ends in I, indicating that it is not in its singular gendered form, but rather in the plural grammatical number. Since it is plural, its pronoun is они. Speaking of plurals, it's crucial to avoid the common confusion between the letters «и» краткое and stressed «и». The letter «и» краткое, which has the sound «й» as in «you», is a consonant in Russian. It has a diacritic sign above it that resembles a cup and represents brevity. This letter's name, «и» краткое, literally translates to «и» brief, which is precisely why it carries the brevity mark above it. On the other hand, the stressed «и» is a vowel. When «и» is stressed, we place a stress mark above it that looks like a notch, but not a cup. So be careful not to confuse them. Returning to the exercise, this activity is quite straightforward. It focuses on the basic rule, avoids exceptions, and doesn't include the soft sign. However, it presents many words to help you develop a strong ability to determine the gender of Russian nouns. By staying attentive and focused, you'll be able to complete this exercise without making any mistakes. Now pause the video, complete the exercise, and I'll see you after. Let's learn how to determine the gender of Russian nouns that end with a soft sign. As we discussed earlier, Russian nouns predominantly have distinct endings for each of the three grammatical genders, as well as the plural number. That's why the initial stage of learning to identify the grammatical gender of a noun was a straightforward and foolproof process, as we could determine the gender simply by looking at the noun's final letter. However, that initial method for determining gender was purposefully simplified, as it left out certain complexities, specifically the use of the soft sign in relation to genders and various exceptions to the rule. Nevertheless, despite our limited focus, the basic rule we learned earlier is remarkably powerful. On its own, it can provide an accuracy rate of about, let's say, 85% when determining the gender of Russian nouns. Thus, before we proceed, I want to stress that although the following information will be more intricate than what we have previously discussed, it holds less real-world significance, as the basic rule remains applicable to a far greater number of situations. However, we certainly can further improve our accuracy by learning how to determine the gender of nouns that end in a soft sign, which, as you may recall, can indicate either the feminine or masculine gender. The soft sign is a special letter in the Russian alphabet that has no sound of its own. Instead, its very existence is rooted in a fundamental feature of the Russian language, the division of consonants into what we call hard and soft. This division essentially means that a consonant letter has two distinct variants of pronunciation. Internationally, the hard variant is referred to as plain, with plain essentially denoting normal. On the other hand, the soft variant is referred to as palatalized, which, if you like, can be understood as abnormal. This means that the sound is produced with the body of the tongue raised towards the palate, hence the term palatalized. The easiest way to experience the unforgettable sensation of palatalization or softening is to pronounce the sound t, represented by the English letter T, while placing the tip of the tongue against the lower front teeth. Since the tip of your tongue will be occupied by your lower incisors, it won't be able to directly participate in articulation. Instead, you'll produce the T sound using the body of the tongue against the upper palate. This transition changes your T from plain to palatalized. Generally, Russian spelling allows us to determine whether a consonant is meant to be hard or soft simply by looking at the letter that follows. However, at the end of a word, there is no subsequent letter to look at. That's why we use the soft sign to indicate the soft or palatalized nature of a final consonant. Since consonants in Russian are commonly softened or palatalized, it's not uncommon for Russian nouns to end with a soft sign. In fact, approximately 12% of the 1,000 most frequently used Russian nouns end in a soft sign, and this proportion remains fairly consistent across the entire Russian language corpus. That's why, instead of simply memorizing the gender of nouns that end in a soft sign, a more effective approach would be to learn the primary gender patterns that occur within the category of nouns that end in a soft sign. Generally, as before, to effectively handle the ambiguity of the soft sign in relation to grammatical gender, we will examine the final parts of nouns. However, these parts are not grammatical endings as in the previous exercise, but either suffixes or final segments of word roots. In general, when searching the internet for information on the gender of nouns ending with a soft sign, one will find that this is quite a complex topic with varying interpretations. Some sources may provide simplified information, while others offer more in-depth and detailed explanations. When dealing with this particular topic in practice, it's crucial to recognize where to draw the line and make a conscious decision in favor of simply remembering the gender of nouns ending in a soft sign instead of applying very advanced rules that often result in diminishing returns. So if we separate the wheat from the chaff, the wheat represents the main part of the rule, while the chaff joins the list of exceptions, nouns whose gender cannot be easily identified using rules or nouns that are not covered by any existing rules. Let me point out that this list of exceptions is quite comprehensive, as it covers the entire B1 lexical minimum and even extends slightly beyond it. Let's examine this information more closely. Let's review the masculine gender first. In the first part of the rule, there are two masculine suffixes, tel and ar, which convey masculine grammatical gender, as seen in words like учитель, словарь. So if a noun ends with one of these masculine suffixes, it is masculine. The suffix tel is the most important one here, as it is much more common. This suffix is typically used to create masculine agent nouns, where the term agent refers to someone or something performing an action. It correlates with the English suffix er, for example, a person who builds, writes, reads is a builder, writer, reader. Similarly, in Russian, строить, строитель, писать, писатель, читать, читатель. The less common suffix ar is a bit more ambiguous, as it's used both to create nouns referring to collections, like in our example, where словарь is a collection of words, or in the same way as tel, to designate a person performing an action, agent, as in секретарь. Both suffixes, especially tel, love to appear in professions and occupations, and they historically acquired a masculine connotation due to men's dominance in various fields throughout history. This is why so many professions in Russian, such as учитель, are grammatically masculine. You may want to ask, can a woman be a teacher? Yes, she can. The conventional path for creating feminine occupational titles has traditionally been to form a separate feminine version by adding a feminine suffix with a corresponding feminine grammatical ending. Our predominant suffix that does this job is needs, which forms feminine versions of words, giving us occupational titles such as учительница, derived from the masculine учитель, teacher, писательница, from the masculine писатель, writer. Yet, in contemporary Russian, this pattern has been gradually fading in favor of an emerging trend toward using the masculine form as a gender-neutral marker for occupations, so alternative feminine forms are no longer strictly necessary. While traditionally gendered forms like учительница or писательница still exist, it is now widely accepted to say она учитель or она писатель, even though these nouns, names of professions, are grammatically masculine. This trend resembles what happened in English, where actresses have essentially become actors, though in Russian the shift has been more gradual rather than revolutionary and is still ongoing. So yes, you can say она учитель, она писатель. The grammar of modern Russian allows this construction where the masculine noun for a profession functions generically, regardless of biological gender. Yet, the noun itself remains grammatically masculine, as these two suffixes tel, ar, denote the masculine grammatical gender of a noun. Next, we have the names of the months. In Russian, all 12 months are masculine, and 9 of them end with a soft sign. For instance, июль. It's also worth noting that the names of months in Russian start with a lowercase letter. Unlike in English, they are not considered proper nouns, just like the days of the week, which also begin with a lowercase letter in Russian. So all names of months in Russian are masculine. They were assimilated from Latin, where they were grammatically masculine as well, by the way, through European languages and retained their masculine gender in Russian. Continuing with the masculine gender, we encounter an orthographic rule that governs gender classification in relation to certain consonants. Ж, Ш, Щ, Ч. When learning Russian, it is essential to understand the role of these consonants as they belong to a larger group of 7 consonants that receive special treatment in Russian language rules. These rules recognize these 7 consonants as special in terms of spelling, grammar, and pronunciation. Let me provide a simple example. If we take the noun этаж, it has a 0 grammatical ending of the hard type. The soft type refers to either the soft sign or и краткое. This means that to form the plural, we would normally add the letter «ы» and get «этажи». However, Russian spelling rules prohibit the use of «ы» after these special 7 consonants, requiring us instead to write «этажи» with «и». These 4 consonants «ж», «ш», «щ», «ч» are special in Russian because they are unpaired in a way that they don't have a second variant of pronunciation like other consonant letters. Their pronunciation remains constant, so they can only be pronounced one way, which means the soft sign does not influence their sound at all. Whether or not a soft sign appears after them, at the end of a word, it exists only on paper as a marker to indicate the gender of the noun. So in terms of these consonants, «ж», «ш», «щ», «ч», if a noun ends in a soft sign, it is grammatically feminine. Otherwise, the absence of the soft sign signals that the noun is masculine. That's why nouns such as этаж, душ, плащ, врач are part of our focus, even though they do not end in a soft sign. This is because for these four specific consonants, the presence or absence of a soft sign directly determines grammatical gender. In general, the patterns just explained are the main ones for determining whether a noun that ends in a soft sign is masculine in Russian. However, it is important to note that not all masculine nouns that end in a soft sign follow these patterns. For example, nouns that end in these three combinations l, n, r have a fairly even distribution of gender between masculine and feminine, while some letter combinations typically associated with feminine gender can also include masculine exceptions. Therefore, while the explained patterns can greatly help us identify nouns that are definitely masculine, there are other nouns that fall outside these patterns and are considered exceptions to the rule. These exceptions need to be eventually memorized. Although there are quite a few nouns in this particular list of exceptions to the rule, this list is designed for long-term learning, as it covers the entire B1 lexical minimum and slightly beyond. For learners at the A1 level, however, only a small handful of nouns need to be memorized. In terms of the feminine gender, there is quite a range of possible suffixes and word final combinations that could be included in the rule to help you determine gender. However, most of them are collectively grouped here under the banner of an ellipsis, 3 dots. I do not specifically list some possible combinations in the rule because they often represent only a few nouns, usually quite advanced. Additionally, many supposedly feminine combinations have masculine exceptions, which complicates conscious learning of such patterns. As such, it would be much easier to treat these as exceptions. As with the masculine gender, feminine exceptions are presented in the list below, which is designed to cover the vast majority of situations encountered when learning Russian grammar as a whole. That's why in the feminine part of the rule, we see only the suffix ost listed specifically. This is because this suffix is very common in Russian, yet its usage becomes prominent as vocabulary grows more advanced. For instance, in the list of the 1,000 most frequent nouns, 3% end in this suffix, meaning that a quarter of all nouns ending in a soft sign have this suffix. In the entire Russian language corpus, this number grows even further, with more than half of all nouns ending in a soft sign having this suffix. This is why in Russian nouns ending in a soft sign have a gender distribution of about 3/4 feminine and 1/4 masculine. Yet, without this suffix, the distribution would be quite balanced. Therefore, applying a statistical rule of 3/4 to 1/4 for guessing the gender of a noun would not be appropriate, as it is based solely on the prevalence of a single extremely common suffix, ost. The Russian suffix ost plays a crucial role in word formation by transforming adjectives into abstract nouns that express a quality, condition, or state associated with that adjective. This is quite similar to how the English suffix -ness functions. For example, when you take the adjective slabый, weak, and replace its grammatical ending -y with the suffix ost, you obtain slabost, which conveys the abstract quality of weakness. However, there are also other important combinations which I have highlighted here. Ось, зн, ать, ади, as in words любовь, жизнь, кровать, площадь, I have specifically listed these combinations because they are commonly found in the A1 vocabulary. Although each combination represents only a small number of words, these words are typically part of the elementary Russian vocabulary. As a result, these combinations will receive equal importance to the ost suffix in our immediate training. And finally, returning to invariant or unpaired consonants, where the soft sign indicates gender. If a soft sign follows one of these four consonants, the noun is definitely feminine, as in examples such as ложь, брошь, вещь, ночь. And finally, in this part of the rule, we have a list of words that we call exceptions. These words represent everything not regulated by this rule and therefore must be memorized eventually. First, exceptions represent a number of combinations indicated by the ellipsis. These combinations may either be generally associated with the feminine gender but have masculine exceptions, or they may be definitely feminine but represent a small number of advanced words. Secondly, this list of words includes nouns that end in the combinations l, n, r, which are fairly evenly distributed between genders. As a result, there is no effective way to determine the gender of nouns that end in these combinations, and they must simply be memorized. From the perspective of learning Russian, this list is quite extensive, as it includes all nouns from the official B1 lexical minimum and slightly beyond that do not fall under this rule. In other words, it covers the vast majority of situations you are likely to encounter when studying Russian grammar. So, in terms of determining the gender of nouns that end in a soft sign, we apply these rules. However, if a noun does not fit within these patterns, it should be treated as an exception and be found in this list of words, which is arranged alphabetically for easier reference. In this list, one notable example is the noun гость, which ends in ost yet is masculine. Why is that? This is because in the case of the noun гость, ost is not a suffix but a part of the word's root, so it does not fall under the ambit of the rule which states that nouns ending in ost are feminine. Another word to note is корабль. While ships can be referred to as she in English, this is not the case in Russian, where the word корабль is strictly a masculine noun. Now let's put this knowledge into practice. To develop the skill of determining the gender of nouns that end in a soft sign, we need to practice by examining the final part of a word, specifically the letter or letters that come before the soft sign, and then matching them to the patterns outlined in the rule. If a noun doesn't fit any of these patterns, we classify it as an exception and refer to the alphabetized list to confirm its gender. The good news is that by practicing with just a few dozen words this way, you'll quickly gain confidence in identifying the gender of nouns ending in a soft sign. Let's take a closer look at the model. In the first example, we have the Russian word тетрадь, which translates to exercise book in English, a type of notebook used by students to write in. Тетрадь ends with at, and by examining the letters before the soft sign and comparing them to our rule, we find a perfect match in this part of the rule. This confirms that тетрадь is a feminine noun, meaning its personal pronoun is она. Next, we have the word душ, which ends with the consonant sh. one of the special consonants mentioned in this part of the rule. Although dush does not end with a soft sign, it is included in our soft sign training because the soft sign after these four special consonants at word final positions exists only in writing to indicate the gender of a noun. Since dush lacks a soft sign, it is classified as a masculine noun, meaning its personal pronoun is on. The next word we have is модель, which ends with a soft sign. When we examine its final letters and compare them to our rule, we don't find a match. Moreover, L is one of the three biggest enemies of soft sign lovers. If a word ends in L and is not part of the suffix tel, we need to refer to the list of exceptions, which are organized alphabetically for easy reference. As you can see, our noun модель appears on the list as feminine, meaning its personal pronoun is она. The next word we have is январь, the first month of the year. As we learned earlier, all Russian month names are masculine, so the personal pronoun for январь is он. The next word in the model is лебедь. Its final letters do not conform to our rule, so we treat it as an exception. According to our list of exceptions, лебедь is a masculine noun. It's worth noting that the vast majority of animal names that end in the soft sign and do not conform to this rule tend to be masculine. This is due to the fact that in Russian, the masculine gender can serve as the default gender, making it also the unmarked or neutral option. So if a noun is ambiguous about gender, the masculine form is used purely by default. This pattern is evident with many animal names. For example, we can determine that the word for horse, лошадь, is feminine because its root ends in ать. Similarly, the word for mouse, мышь, is feminine because it ends in a soft sign after the letter ша. However, nouns like лебедь are typically masculine. And finally, we have беременность, which contains the main suffix in our training, ость, available in at least half of the nouns that end in a soft sign. However, it is common only in advanced vocabulary, so it's not as frequently encountered when learning Russian. According to our rule, if a noun ends in ость, it is feminine. To complete this exercise, follow these steps. First, examine the final letters of the word. Next, compare them to the combinations listed in the rule for determining gender. If there is no match, consult the list of exceptions. Finally, use the appropriate Russian personal pronoun to indicate whether the noun is masculine or feminine. Before you start practicing this exercise, it's important to note that it is quite extensive and covers a broad range of vocabulary. This exercise is extensive because determining the gender of Russian nouns that end in a soft sign requires practice to develop the skill effectively. Regarding vocabulary, the exercise includes a wide selection of words that go beyond the B1 level to provide thorough grammatical practice. However, there is no need to memorize these words. Most of them are not required at the A1 level. Okay, let's pause the video and complete the exercise. I'll see you when you're finished. Moving forward, let's continue deepening our understanding of the grammatical genders of Russian nouns. masculine, feminine, and neuter. In general, the rules for determining the gender of Russian nouns are pretty straightforward, as we decide whether a noun belongs to a specific grammatical gender simply by looking at its last letter. All three Russian grammatical genders predominantly have unique endings that are easily distinguishable, so the process remains quite straightforward. However, there is one noticeable exception, the soft sign, which can be used for both masculine and feminine genders. That's why, after becoming familiar with Russian grammatical genders, we focused on this particular nuance, applying the extension to the basic rule, which regulates the distribution of nouns ending in a soft sign between the masculine and feminine genders. Now let's proceed with the third and final part of our essential training devoted to grammatical genders of Russian nouns, the exceptions. In essence, exceptions are a category of nouns whose final letters, which usually determine the gender of a noun, do not align with their genuine grammatical gender. First and foremost, this occurs when the meaning of a noun determined by its biological or natural gender conflicts with its grammatical ending. In such situations, natural gender takes precedence over the grammatical ending. Secondly, in Russian, there is a category of nouns known as irregular nouns, which are considered irregular because they do not follow standard grammar rules. Typically, these irregular words and their forms reflect the remnants of archaic grammatical patterns preserved from earlier stages of the language, making them exceptions to contemporary grammar. Having irregular forms of words is a natural feature of a language. For example, in English, there is a vast category of irregular verbs, such as to sit, which is irregular because its past tense is sat rather than following the standard ed ending, which would yield seated. Similarly, go becomes went and gone instead of goed. In a language, irregular forms tend to be retained in the most frequently used words, with their constant use helping preserve them over centuries of language evolution. This supports historical patterns that no longer conform the modern Russian rules. The Russian language, like English, also has irregularities that have been preserved in some common words, and you're bound to love them. Returning to gender, a third category of nouns in Russian is known as indeclinable or invariant nouns. These are borrowed foreign words that have not been properly assimilated or adopted into the Russian language. As a result, they don't have grammatical endings. Therefore, the standard rule for determining a noun's gender based on its ending does not apply to these words. Let's take a closer look at this diagram, which outlines common exceptions to the main rule for identifying the grammatical gender of Russian nouns. As you can see, the first part of this diagram highlights situations where nouns that denote men have feminine grammatical endings. Here we have the four most common Russian masculine nouns with a feminine ending: мужчина, папа, дедушка, дядя. These four words are by far the most common exceptions to the rule that a noun's grammatical gender is determined by its ending. In these instances, the meanings of the nouns indicating male biological sex conflict with their feminine grammatical endings. In such contradictory cases, the meaning or natural gender takes precedence over the ending. As a result, despite having feminine endings, these nouns are considered masculine because they denote man. It's worth mentioning that there are other nouns that could fit into this group, but they belong to either advanced, colloquial, or archaic vocabularies. Therefore, expanding this category beyond these four examples isn't necessary at the moment. If you are curious about why the grammatical endings of these common words contradict biological sex, the general answer to the question why almost always lies in historical patterns within the evolution of the language. To a much lesser extent, ongoing linguistic changes also play a role, and over time these changes will themselves become part of history. For example, the first word, mужчина, is a very common word in the modern Russian language. In its current modern form, the word mужчина was adopted approximately 500 years ago from the Polish language through the process of the so-called Polonization, influenced by the immediate proximity of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a major power in Europe with its culture, language, and social customs highly regarded by the neighboring elites. Moreover, at times, the Commonwealth had established control or influence over territories that are now part of modern Russia. During the Polonization period, Polish words surged into the Russian language, sometimes defying the established grammatical rules of that time. Hence, the feminine ending of this word, which originally was not feminine at all. The remaining three words in this list belong to the family vocabulary, which has always been influenced by the inherent desire to express affection and informality towards close people. An additional factor is what is now known as child speech, referring to the tendency for open vowels to be favored by children. These sounds are not only easier for young children to articulate, but also naturally softer and more endearing, making them a common feature in affectionate language. The word дедушка obtained its feminine grammatical ending through a diminutive or affectionate process. It is derived from дед, an old but still common word used for a grandfather, a word with a rather formal tone that can convey more of an old man than a beloved grandfather. So, by incorporating a hypochoristic suffix and feminine ending, the word дедушка sounds affectionate, better reflecting its intended meaning. A similar phenomenon is seen with дядя, where the influence of child speech facilitated its assimilation. Similarly, despite papa being an internationalism present in many languages, it entered Russian via French during the 18th and 19th centuries, when French was fashionable among the Russian aristocracy, leading to the adoption of many French words into Russian. The word papa effortlessly became part of family communication, not just due to the widespread trend of borrowing French words at the time, but also because its vowel ending gave it a more affectionate and warm, family-friendly tone. In the second part of this rule, you can see informal variants of Russian masculine names, which typically feature feminine endings. The reason behind their grammatical feminization is the same factor we just discussed: informality and affection. By using alternative forms of a name, we typically express our casual or warm attitude toward a person. This is similar to English, where informal or affectionate variants of names like Johnny or Freddie act as softened versions of their formal counterparts, creating a sense of familiarity and warmth. In Russian, given names typically have separate alternative forms within three categories: full or official form, short or colloquial form, and diminutive hypochoristic form. The first category of our given names is the full or formal one. We address people using this form of a name primarily within formal or semi-formal communication contexts. These names are our official names that can be found in our IDs, for example. The second category represents short, familiar, or informal variants of a first name, like Vanya. We call people using this form of a name informally, meaning in most real-life situations. The third form of a given name is diminutive, or what we call in Russian the diminutive hyperchoristic form, an affectionate form in which a suffix is added to the base form, intensifying its emotional connotation, such as Vanichka or Vanyusha. Parents may use this form of a name when addressing their young children, and grandparents might as well. Loved ones often use these forms to express endearment toward one another. So when it comes to informal forms of names, it's a common practice in Russian for masculine names to take on feminine endings, as most masculine names develop feminine endings in their informal and diminutive hyperchoristic versions. And of course, despite their feminine grammatical endings, the gender of these names remains masculine. As we've discussed, when biological sex conflicts with a grammatical ending, natural gender takes precedence. Moving forward, let's turn our attention to foreign names. Since foreign names originate outside of Russian culture, they may or may not conform to Russian grammar rules. Therefore, we need to treat foreign names according to the just discussed protocol for Russian informal names, meaning we consider the biological gender of the name's bearer. In these examples, the name Joshua ends with A, which would typically indicate the feminine gender for a native Russian name. On the other hand, the name Jane ends with a consonant, which would typically indicate the masculine gender for a native Russian name. As we discussed earlier, when natural gender contradicts a grammatical ending, natural gender prevails. Therefore, the name Joshua is considered masculine and the name Jane is considered feminine. In the next row, we see a fascinating rare category of nouns that end with the combination mya. This number 10 in parentheses refers not to 10 teeth, as one might initially think, but to the fact that there are only 10 nouns in Russian that end with mya. However, only 5 of these nouns are listed in this illustration, with 2 being important at the A1 level. This is because not all nouns that end with mya belong to the common Russian vocabulary. So in this category, there are only 2 truly important words: imя, время. These are very common words in Russian, as you might guess. As you already know, nouns that end in ya are feminine in Russian, such as семья. However, when a consonant m appears directly before the grammatical ending ya, these nouns are neuter. Why? Well, because these 10 nouns that end with mya are living remnants of the ancient declension system, inherited from Old East Slavic and even further back, Old Church Slavonic. As such, they don't care about the modern Russian grammatical rules. Instead, they follow an ancient grammatical protocol of their own, meaning that their grammatical behavior must be learned separately, which is incrementally done within the topic of grammatical cases in the course of Russian grammar. In this part, we see invariant, immutable, or unchangeable nouns, which are known in Russian as indeclinable nouns. These are nouns that are not only of foreign origin, but also peculiar in the way they grammatically behave in Russian. Indeclinable nouns is a category of nouns named this way because nouns of this type cannot be declined, meaning grammatically changed. They always maintain their default grammatical form regardless of the context. This means standard Russian grammar rules do not apply to them. This is not necessarily a bad thing because these words are very simple in terms of grammar. Thus, you can immediately add them to your active Russian vocabulary and use with confidence right away. This is because in different grammatical cases and even in the plural number, these nouns of foreign origin do not change their form, unlike native and nativized nouns do. It is important to note that not all foreign nouns that enter the Russian language are indeclinable or invariant. In fact, most of them become fully assimilated into Russian and begin following Russian grammar rules completely. In this sense, the Russian language has successfully digested the vast majority of foreign words that have entered it, making them fully Russian, if not in terms of origin, but in terms of grammar at least. Yet, not all of them. The general tendency is as follows. If a foreign noun, after entering the Russian language, does not fit properly into the masculine or feminine grammatical gender systems, meaning it doesn't end in a consonant, и краткое, the soft sign, a or ya, it becomes an indeclinable noun of the neuter gender unless it has a biological sex. As you can see, this pattern does not include nouns that could potentially fully integrate into the neuter gender grammatical system and adhere to Russian grammatical rules rather than becoming invariant. This is because proper assimilation into the neuter gender essentially stopped in the 19th century, or at least did not continue to the same extent. This happened due to the fascination of the Russian-educated classes at the time with French, and to some extent German, leading to the adoption of foreign words in their default forms, ultimately hindering the full assimilation of foreign nouns into the neuter gender. As a result, while nouns like computer or pizza, which nicely adhered with the masculine or feminine grammatical endings, have become full-fledged words that follow Russian grammatical rules, nouns like metro or kino did not have such a luxury when coming into Russian. By the time they arrived, it was too late. The loss of the ability to properly assimilate foreign nouns into the neuter gender system, combined with the fact that the final letters of adopted foreign nouns may simply not comply with any existing Russian gender endings, like kenguru or taxi, has led to indeclinable nouns becoming fairly common in Russian. Today, there are potentially up to 2,500 nouns that fall into the indeclinable category, with several dozen being commonly used, and these should be treated as exceptions to the standard rules. So these nouns that we call indeclinable nouns are words that do not follow the standard grammar rules of the Russian language, as they always retain their original invariant form in both the plural number and across all grammatical cases. The final vowels of these nouns are considered part of their roots rather than grammatical endings. As a result, indeclinable nouns have no grammatical endings and thus cannot change their forms. To determine the gender of such nouns, we can use the following approach. Indeclinable nouns without a natural gender are typically neuter, while those with a natural gender have the same grammatical gender as their biological one. In ambiguous situations where the biological gender is difficult to discern, such as with animals, we treat them as masculine until proven otherwise. To ingrain your understanding of the logic behind indeclinable nouns, let's delve into each of these common indeclinable nouns in our list. We need to understand this logic because A1 training heavily relies on internationalisms, words that tend to look and sound very similar across many modern languages. As a result, during the training process, you will frequently encounter exceptions from this indeclinable category, which, by the way, is not necessarily a bad thing. These exceptions are very simple in terms of grammar as they are unaffected by grammar rules. This means you will be able to immediately add such words to your active Russian vocabulary and use them confidently right away. First, кофе, the exception among exceptions. Originally, the word кофе came into Russian as the word кофе, which was initially masculine as its root ended in the letter I краткая. However, later this word shifted to a new modern international form with the vowel «e» at the end, which, according to the laws of assimilation, should have made it neuter. However, old habits die hard, so in the minds of people, coffee remained masculine as a remnant of the archaic masculine word «кофе». Moreover, unreasonably, referring to coffee as it soon came to be seen as a sign of poor education. This perception helped the word retain its grammatically masculine form to this day, as no one wants to appear uneducated for some reason. Nowadays, however, society is gradually becoming more accepting of the neuter form. In fact, even dictionaries have started to reference the neuter gender, though the label colloquial is added in parentheses. Although the masculine grammatical gender is still supported by tradition and protected by dictionaries, specialists predict that кофе may soon become neuter, which might happen already in the next century. As for you personally, although some Russian native speakers call coffee it, during this century you should stick to the traditional strictly masculine variant. So the word кофе is an exception among exceptions, as on top of being grammatically invariant, it has retained its archaic masculine grammatical gender. Next up, виски. Виски, which came into Russian from English, ends in e, which according to Russian grammar could be interpreted as plural ending. As an adopted foreign word, the final vowel of виски is not considered a grammatical ending as it would be for a native Russian word. Instead, it is considered part of the root. As a result, whiskey is neuter because it does not end in a masculine or a feminine ending and does not have a natural gender. Like кофе, whiskey can also be considered masculine, particularly among aficionados. This is partially because when we say whiskey, we can imply a whiskey drink, and the Russian word for a drink is напиток. It is masculine. However, whiskey aficionados are not as ferocious as coffee adepts, so both neuter and masculine genders for whiskey are correct and acceptable in the modern Russian language, with the neuter gender being the default gender for this noun. Next, madame. Madame is a feminine noun in meaning that ends in a consonant. And as we already know, native Russian nouns that end in a consonant are masculine. However, madame is not a native Russian word, so it is not subject to standard Russian grammar rules. As previously discussed, if a foreign noun has a biological or natural gender, it overrides grammar. Therefore, madame belongs to the feminine grammatical gender since this noun denotes a woman. Despite ending in a consonant, madame has not been properly assimilated into the Russian language due to the contradiction between its feminine meaning and masculine ending. That's why it's indeclinable. However, if madame referred to a man, it would not be an invariant noun because there would be no conflict between its ending and natural gender. A similar phenomenon can be observed with the previously introduced foreign names Joshua, Jane, where the final letters directly contradict natural gender. Being foreign nouns with a clear conflict between their endings and natural gender, these names are also indeclinable. Yet, if we swap natural genders, making Joshua, a woman, and Jane, a man, they would no longer be indeclinable, but would follow Russian grammar rules. Next, kenguru. As previously discussed, this noun ends in the letter U, which is not an ending. A native Russian noun in the default nominative form can end with. Therefore, this word could not be fully assimilated into the Russian language without replacing the last letter. As you can see, the last letter was not replaced. Thus, kenguru is invariant because its last vowel, U, cannot be a nominative or default grammatical ending in Russian. However, kenguru is the name of a specific animal, a living creature with a biological sex, so it cannot be classified as grammatically neuter in Russian. While in English it surely can be it, grammatical animacy in Russian works differently and is based on the ability to move deliberately in space. Thus, a wolf, for example, is not what, but who. Who is this? This is a wolf. So just like a wolf, a kangaroo must have a proper gender, meaning be either masculine or feminine. The gender of the noun kenguru is masculine because in Russian the masculine gender is the default grammatical gender, which, if needed, can also be considered the unmarked or neutral option. However, if the biological sex of a kangaroo is discernible, it can be treated as feminine as well, meaning we can refer to the kangaroo as she if needed. As for the word taxi, it came into Russian from French in the beginning of the 20th century, and its final letter it was not changed during its adoption. We can see that taxi ends in the vowel e, which in Russian grammar could suggest a plural ending. However, taxi is a foreign word that was adopted into Russian in its default form, so its last vowel is not a grammatical ending, but part of its root. When a word is foreign and its final letter after assimilation doesn't conform to the masculine or feminine endings, it is destined for the unfortunate fate of becoming an indeclinable noun, neuter by default, unless it has a biological sex. Therefore, while foreign words that end in a consonant such as computer or internet were properly assimilated and have become full-fledged Russian words, if not by origin, then at least by grammar, meaning they have acquired the masculine grammatical gender and therefore can change grammatical endings appropriately following the masculine gender system, words like taxi have become invariant neuter nouns. Next, jury. The word jury ends in e, which could be interpreted as a plural ending for Russian nouns, but since it's a foreign word that neither ends in a masculine or feminine ending, its last letter is not a decisive factor, as we've already established. Therefore, just like taxi, jury is a neuter invariant singular noun. While a jury implies a group of people, similarly to nouns like public, army, and crowd, it's a collective noun that is grammatically singular, just like in English. Keep in mind, however, that invariability doesn't mean you cannot apply the plural form to nouns like jury. You can freely use such words with grammatical plurality. However, in the plural form, indeclinable nouns are spelled and pronounced exactly the same as in singular. So despite these words being invariant, they can still be used like other nouns, but they always retain their invariant default form. So, jury is a neuter, indeclinable noun, singular by default, but it can also be used as a plural noun when necessary. However, since it's indeclinable, jury has only one form, meaning you cannot directly say juries in Russian, just like you can't say kangaroos, only kangaroo. In this column, we have a couple of nouns that actually end in vowels that comply with the Russian gender system, but they are still indeclinable, meaning their final letters are not considered grammatical endings. Why? As previously mentioned, due to the loss of the ability to properly assimilate foreign nouns into the neuter gender system in the 18th and 19th centuries, foreign nouns are now fully assimilated into the Russian language if they comply with either masculine or feminine genders. This means that even if a foreign word aligns with the neuter gender, it still becomes an invariant noun lacking a grammatical ending. Therefore, when the noun metro entered the Russian language in the first half of the 20th century, it was already too late for it to properly integrate into the neuter gender system. As a result, despite ending in or and being fit to be a full-fledged Russian noun of the neuter gender, like vino, wine, it became an indeclinable neuter noun. Next, café. Basically, the logic here is similar to that of métro. It's a French word that came into Russian in the late 19th century, settling into the already established practice of using original, indeclinable forms for the neuter gender. Combined with its final stress and atypical pronunciation of the final vowel, which made it distinctly foreign, café was classified as a neuter invariant noun. And now the last couple of nouns, menu and show. As for the noun menu, on top of being a foreign word, it ends in a vowel that doesn't function as a grammatical ending in Russian nouns in their default nominative case. Therefore, since this noun has no biological sex, it is a neuter invariant noun without a grammatical ending. As for show, also a foreign word, it ends in u, which is an atypical vowel for Russian nouns in the nominative case. So it is obviously a neuter invariant noun without a grammatical ending as well. The final notable point worth mentioning is the challenge of determining the gender of place names, toponyms, around the world, such as cities, countries, deserts, lakes, rivers, and so on. As you might guess, many of these names originated outside the Russian language, and therefore do not necessarily comply with the fundamental rules of Russian grammar regarding gender, as their endings often feature letters that seem wrong from the perspective of traditional Russian grammatical patterns. To begin with, it's important to note that when a foreign toponym, like any other adopted foreign noun, aligns with either the Russian masculine or feminine grammatical gender system, it becomes a fully functional Russian noun of either masculine or feminine genders. As a result, it adheres directly to our foundational rule: a noun that ends in a consonant, including I краткая, is masculine, a noun that ends in a or ya is feminine, and a noun that ends in the soft sign can be either feminine or masculine. Therefore, these cities are assigned the masculine gender as they end in a consonant. Париж, Вашингтон, Madrid, Shanghai, Sydney. Similarly, these cities are assigned the feminine gender as they end in a or ya. Ottawa, Praga, Jakarta, Sofia, Valencia. Since the names of these cities adhere to Russian grammatical rules as they end in the proper letters, these names are full-fledged Russian nouns not by origin, but at least by grammar, and they acquire the appropriate gender and follow Russian grammatical rules. Yet, if a toponym's name ends with a soft sign, determining its gender isn't easy, as we encounter the same issue as before. Such names can be either masculine or feminine. For example, cities in Russia like Perm, Rязань, Kazan, Tver, which end in a soft sign, are classified as feminine. However, cities like Yaroslavl, Stavropol also end in a soft sign but are assigned a masculine gender. This is because gender assignment in toponyms depends on etymology, tradition, and cultural associations, making it difficult to determine in ambiguous situations, such as those involving the soft sign. However, sometimes knowing the gender is easier. For instance, Belarus is undoubtedly feminine, as its name echoes the ancient term Rus, which has always carried a distinctly feminine essence, a kind of motherland archetype. In the case of Yaroslavl, the reason is also clear. Its name is connected to the masculine given name, Yaroslav, defining its masculine meaning. What about the other possible endings we discussed earlier? Those situations where nouns don't end in letters that indicate masculine or feminine gender. Do they also function as invariant or indeclinable nouns of the neuter grammatical gender, like taxi and menu did earlier? While toponyms don't strictly follow the same gender pattern, they do behave like indeclinable nouns, such as taxi, menu, when their final letters don't fit the masculine or feminine genders. As a result, their forms remain unchanged across grammatical cases and in the plural. Consider the capitals of Mexico and Russia. Mexico, Moskva. Unlike Moskva, whose endings properly change depending on grammatical case, Mexico remains invariant. However, when determining gender, we don't automatically classify such toponyms as Mexico as neuter, like we did earlier with nouns like taxi, menu, metro. Instead, we follow a practical rule of thumb. Gender is assigned based on the category of the object the name represents, a method that works in the vast majority of situations. For example, let's take the following cities: Mexico, Mali, Tbilisi, Baku, Malmö. These are cities whose names end in wrong letters from the perspective of traditional Russian grammatical patterns, meaning they cannot be automatically assigned to either the feminine or masculine gender. To assign gender, we apply a rule of thumb. We need to find a noun identifier that defines the category of the object the name represents and then choose the gender based on that identifier. Of course, their identifier would be город, city, town, a masculine noun in Russian. According to this rule of thumb, these cities inherit their gender from their identifier, город. As a result, they are masculine in Russian. But let's imagine these were not cities, but rivers. In this case, the identifier would be река, river, which is a feminine noun, so they would be feminine as well in this hypothetical scenario. What if they were lakes? The identifier for a lake is the neuter noun, озеро, so they would be neuter as well. Therefore, to determine the gender of a toponym that does not end in one of the letters associated with masculine or feminine nouns, we use an identifier and transfer its gender to the toponym. Thus, these cities inherit their gender from the masculine noun город, making them masculine. Tokyo, San Paulo, San Francisco, Delhi, Oslo. Rivers inherit their gender from the feminine noun река, making them feminine. Mississippi, Congo, Zambezi, Ohio, Yangtze. Lakes inherit their gender from the neuter noun озеро, so they are neuter. Ontario, Erie, Kivu, Malawi, Koma. Deserts inherit their gender from the feminine noun пустыня, making them feminine. Каракумы, Kalahari, Gobi, Karoo, Mojave. That was the rule of thumb for determining the gender of toponyms that end in wrong letters from the perspective of Russian grammar, meaning those that do not belong to the masculine or feminine categories. Yet, this pattern can sometimes lead to ambiguous situations where a noun can potentially belong to more than one gender, because a toponym can have more than one identifier. For example, a country, страна, is feminine, but it can also be viewed as a state, государство, which is neuter. So countries like Peru, Lesotho, Chile, which feature wrong final letters in terms of Russian grammar, have primary identifiers that are feminine and neuter, meaning they can be viewed as either. Statistically, the neuter gender variant that comes from государство, state, prevails in Russian, which is why dictionaries typically list them as neuter by default. As a result, countries ending in wrong letters should be considered neuter by default, but feminine gender is also used. That's it for the basic introduction to indeclinable exceptions, nouns that remain in their default form in both singular and plural grammatical numbers, as well as across all grammatical cases. This category is quite common as potentially up to 2,500 nouns belong to it, with several dozen being commonly used in Russian. Now let's complete an exercise focused on learning to determine the grammatical gender of Russian nouns that are exceptions. These include nouns whose final letters do not comply with their genuine grammatical gender, or nouns without a grammatical ending that are indeclinable in Russian. Many of these words in this exercise were taken directly from the rule we just reviewed. So if you have any difficulties, feel free to refer to this diagram. However, I've also included additional nouns that aren't directly represented in the examples from this rule. For these nouns, you'll need to use your own knowledge to determine their gender. Before we begin, let's take a moment to review the model. The noun мужчина is masculine because even though it has a feminine ending, it refers to a man. As a result, the appropriate pronoun to use is он. Jane is a foreign female name. Even though it ends in a consonant, the appropriate personal pronoun to use is она. The noun имя ends in mя, which places it in a select group of 10 Russian nouns that are neuter despite having a feminine ending. As a result, the appropriate pronoun to use is оно. Alibi is a distinctly foreign word that ends in «и», which is a plural ending for Russian native nouns. Thus, it's an indeclinable noun of the neuter grammatical gender. As a result, the appropriate pronoun to use is оно. The noun каноэ ends in «э», which is an atypical vowel for a Russian noun to end in. As a result, it's an invariant foreign noun, and the appropriate pronoun to use is оно. Similarly, the noun кенгуру also ends in the atypical vowel «у». However, this noun refers to an animal. As we learned earlier, animals have natural gender and are also grammatically animate in Russian, which means that the personal pronoun оно, it, is not used to refer to nouns that name them. Instead, we use the personal pronouns он or она. Since this specific context doesn't provide specific information about the biological gender of the kangaroo, we choose the masculine pronoun because masculine is the default grammatical gender in Russian. Therefore, the appropriate personal pronoun to use is он. And finally, Mississippi is она because it is a river with the identifier река. Now it's time to pause the video and complete the exercise according to the model at the top, which instructs you to fill in the personal pronouns that correspond to the Russian nouns listed on the left. Congratulations, comrade! You've successfully wrestled with the mighty Russian gender system and come out victorious. You now possess a solid ability to determine the gender of nouns, a strong foundation that will serve you well as you continue your expedition into the mists of the Russian language. But wait, there is more. Russian is a gendered language, which means gender doesn't stop at nouns. Adjectives, pronouns, numerals, participles, and even verbs in the past tense all bow before gender. Fortunately, thanks to the skill you've already acquired, figuring out their gender won't feel like deciphering an ancient code. These words obediently inherit gender from the nouns and pronouns they describe, so you won't need to perform detective work to determine their gender. Of course, no skill is mastered in a single day, but with continued practice and exposure, recognizing gender will become second nature, like spotting a bear in the forest. Keep going, and remember, the more you engage with the language, the easier it becomes.